You wake at 3 in the morning. It is still dark outside. The air is cold and damp. You pull on clothes that are stiff with dried filth from yesterday. The smell never leaves them no matter how many times you wash. You eat a piece of bread, hard and stale, and then you step outside into the empty streets. No one else is awake. No one sees you leave. That is intentional. Your work must happen in darkness, in silence, before the city wakes. You walk quickly through narrow alleys toward the edges of town where the cesspits and privies are overflowing. You can smell them before you see them. That thick, choking stench of human waste that has been accumulating for weeks. You stop at the first house. You knock quietly. No one answers. They never do. They leave payment by the door and stay inside, pretending you do not exist. You take the money, gather your tools, and begin the work that keeps this entire city from drowning in its own filth. This was life in Britain and America throughout the 1700s and 1800s, a time when cities were expanding rapidly, but sanitation infrastructure had not caught up. There were no underground sewer systems, no treatment plants, no running water in most homes. People used outdoor privies or indoor chamber pots, and all of that waste went into cesspits, deep holes dug beneath or beside houses. These pits filled quickly, especially in densely populated areas. When they overflowed, waste seeped into streets, contaminated wells, and spread disease. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery killed thousands every year. The only solution was to have someone manually empty the cesspits. These workers were called night-sill men or gong farmers, and they operated in the dead of night because the sight and smell of their work was considered too offensive for daylight hours. Without them, cities would have become uninhabitable. But society treated them as the lowest of the low, untouchable and barely human, even as it depended entirely on their labor. His name was George. He was 31 years old when he became a night-sill man. He had worked as a dockhand for most of his 20s, loading and unloading ships, but an injury to his shoulder left him unable to do heavy lifting. He had a wife and 2 young sons living in a cramped room in a boarding house. They were behind on rent. George needed work desperately, and there were no options left. A contractor who managed night-sill crews approached him one evening, knowing George was out of work. The man offered him a position. The pay was better than most manual labor because almost no one would do it. George asked what the work involved. The contractor told him plainly, emptying cesspits by hand, carrying human waste through the streets, disposing of it outside the city. George felt his stomach turn, but he looked at his wife holding their sleeping children and he knew he had no choice. He accepted. The contractor told him to report at midnight. George did not sleep that night. The work began in total darkness. George met the crew, 4 other men, all older and hardened by years of this labor. They spoke little. There was nothing to say. They walked to the first house on their list, a large residence where the cesspit was located in the back courtyard. The contractor unlocked the wooden cover over the pit. The smell that erupted was so overpowering that George gagged and stepped back. The other men did not react. They had long since stopped reacting. One man climbed down into the pit using a ladder. It was roughly 8 feet deep and filled nearly to the top with human excrement, urine, and whatever else had been thrown in over the months. The man at the bottom used a bucket and a long-handled scoop to fill containers that were hauled up by rope. George's job was to carry the full buckets to a cart waiting in the alley and dump them. The waste was thick, semi-solid in some places, liquid in others. It sloshed and spilled as he carried it. It soaked through his clothes. It splashed onto his hands and face. The smell was inside his nose, his mouth, his lungs. He vomited twice in the first hour. The other men ignored him. They just kept working. The crew moved from house to house, pit to pit, emptying each one bucket by bucket. Some pits were shallow and only took an hour. Others were massive, requiring the entire night to clear. George worked mechanically, his mind shutting down to protect itself from the horror of what he was doing. He stopped thinking. He just lifted, carried, dumped, and repeated. By dawn, the cart was full. They hauled it to a field on the outskirts of the city where the waste was dumped into massive piles that would eventually be sold to farmers as fertilizer. George stood there as the sun rose, covered head to toe in filth, and realized this was his life now. He would spend every night like this, and everyone would know what he did. George stopped being able to maintain any normal social life. The smell clung to him no matter how many times he washed. It was in his skin, his hair, under his fingernails. People could tell what he did before he even spoke. Shopkeepers refused to let him inside. His landlord received complaints from other tenants and told George his family had to leave. They moved to a shack on the edge of town where other Neitzel workers lived. His wife stopped looking at him the same way. She could not hide her disgust. She tried, but George saw it in her eyes. His sons were bullied relentlessly. Other children called them filth eaters and waste boys. His youngest son came home crying almost every day. George wanted to protect him, but he had no power. The job had stripped him of dignity, respect, and humanity. He was just the man who carried shit. That was all anyone saw. The isolation consumed George. He stopped trying to talk to people outside his crew. He stopped going to church because the congregation made it clear he was not welcome. He stopped attending community gatherings. He existed in a shadow world, working at night, sleeping during the day, invisible to the society he served. He started drinking to numb the shame and the smell that seemed to live inside him permanently. He became angry and bitter. His wife begged him to find other work, but there was none. He was trapped, and every night he descended into another cesspit, hauled another bucket, and hated himself a little more. Think about this. Imagine doing work that is absolutely essential for public health, work that prevents disease and death, and being treated like you are subhuman because of it. Imagine your children suffering because of a job you took to feed them. Could you carry that burden? And what does it say about a society that needs this work but despises the people who do it? The dangers were constant and severe. Cesspits produce toxic gases, primarily methane and hydrogen sulfide, that could kill within seconds. Men suffocated regularly when they climbed into pits without proper ventilation. George saw it happen. A worker descended into a deep pit one night, and halfway down he just stopped moving. He slumped against the ladder and slid down into the waste. Two other men tried to pull him out, but the gas overcame them too. All three died before anyone could reach them. Their bodies were left in the pit until morning, when authorities could retrieve them with ropes. The contractor hired replacements the next night. The work never stopped. George developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing toxic fumes every shift. He coughed constantly, bringing up black phlegm. His lungs were being destroyed slowly, but he had no choice but to keep working. Disease was another ever-present threat. The waste George handled carried cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and parasites. He had open cuts and blisters on his hands from the rough work. Every shift was an opportunity for infection. He became sick multiple times, burning with fever, unable to keep food down. His wife nursed him as best she could, but there was no doctor willing to treat a Neitzel man. George survived through sheer luck. Others did not. He knew men who died from infections that started as small cuts and spread through their bodies within days. But here is what most people do not realize. Neitzel men were legally required to work only at night because daytime removal was considered a public nuisance. Laws were passed specifically to keep this work invisible. Society wanted the service but refused to acknowledge it was happening. The workers were criminalized if they operated during daylight hours. They could be fined or arrested for being seen doing their jobs. So they worked in darkness, hidden and ashamed, while the city slept and pretended they did not exist. George was essential and illegal at the same time. Society needed him to survive but punished him for being visible. Now think about this. We still hide the uncomfortable work that keeps our world functioning. Garbage is collected early in the morning. Wastewater is processed underground. Slaughterhouses are built far from cities. We benefit from these services every day, but we design systems so we never have to see them or think about the people who do them. Has anything really changed? Most Neitzel men did not last more than 5 years. The combination of toxic exposure, disease, physical exhaustion, and social destruction broke them. Some died on the job. Others drank themselves to death. A few simply disappeared, abandoning their families and wandering away to die alone. George lasted 6 years. By the end, he was 40 pounds lighter, his lungs were failing, and he looked 20 years older. He coughed blood regularly. His hands were permanently scarred and discolored. He had given up on any hope of a better life. He just existed, moving through each night, waiting for death. George's end came during a particularly cold winter. He was working in a deep cesspit when he slipped on the icy ladder and fell. He plunged into the waste, going under completely. The other men pulled him out quickly, but he had inhaled liquid sewage. His lungs filled. He could not breathe. They carried him home, and he died 2 days later, drowning slowly in his own bed as his lungs failed. He was 37 years old. His wife and sons were evicted shortly after because they could not pay rent. The contractor hired another desperate man to take George's place. The cesspits still needed to be emptied. Society needed people like George to prevent public health catastrophes. Without Nightsil men, cities would have been overwhelmed by waste and disease. Cholera and typhoid would have killed even more people. The streets would have been rivers of sewage. George and thousands like him made urban life possible during a critical period when infrastructure had not yet developed. They worked in the worst conditions imaginable so everyone else could live in relative cleanliness. But society gave them nothing in return except wages that barely covered survival and social exile that destroyed their families. George sacrificed his health, his dignity, and his life so the city could function. And the city forgot him the moment he was gone. The job eventually disappeared. Underground sewer systems were built. Mechanical pumps replaced manual labor. Public sanitation became professionalized and regulated. But that change took decades. The men who worked as Nightsil men during the worst years had no protections, no recognition, and no hope that things would improve. George was one of them. He did work that made society function, and society repaid him with contempt and an early grave. George is gone now. The cesspits he emptied have been filled in and built over. The streets he walked at night have been paved and lit. The city he served has grown and modernized, but the principle remains. Every functioning society depends on work that is essential but invisible, necessary but despised. George did that work. He carried waste so others would not have to. He breathed poison so the city could breathe clean. He died so the system could continue, and no one remembers his name. If you think being a Nightsil man was the darkest essential job in history, there were others. Jobs that were even more dangerous, even more isolating, even more critical to survival. Jobs that societies built themselves upon and then pretended never existed.